Good evening, everyone. Tonight's shiur, as always, Lilu Nishmat Avi Mori Do Ber Ber Nuven Halevi Imim Maroti Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And this Shabbos, we have the privilege of starting a new book number 4 out of 5, Sefer Bamidbar, also known very interestingly as Chumash HaPekudim, the book of the countings, which roughly translates to the English term numbers. And tonight we're going to talk primarily about one of the tribes, the tribe of Levi, and the counting of the Leviim. And let's go right to our sources. Chapter 3 is where we're going to be focusing on today. And primarily we're going to start, I'm only starting with verse 11, 12, and 13 as an intro, because Hashem first, before Hashem tells Moshe to count the tribe of Levi, he is basically explaining why. And so we're going to start with Pasuk Yud Aleph and Parak Gimel. Hashem speaks to Moshe and tells him, Ani ne'elakachti et halviim mitoch b'nei Yisrael. I have taken the Leviim from the midst of Am Yisrael, tachat kol bechor peta arechem b'nei Yisrael, in place of all of the firstborn that opens the womb from the children of Israel. Vayuli halviim, and the Leviim should be for me. Because to me, all of the firstborn belong to me on the day that I killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. All firstborn in Israel becomes set aside for me. From man, including and animals, they should be to me, Ani Hashem. Now, as a result of these psukim, we have a couple of concepts of, firstly, the concept of pidyon b'chor, that a firstborn has to be redeemed. And the same concept with the firstborn animal has to be brought on the mizbeach unless it is blemished, and it can't be brought, in which case it has to also be redeemed. Okay, then, and this is what I want to primarily focus on tonight. Shem speaks to Moshe in Midbar Sinai and tells him the following: Pikod et b'nei Levi, levet avotam lemishpotam. I want you to count the children of Levi from according to each of the families. According to each household within the family, kol zachar mi ben chodesh v'malatif gedem. Every male from the age of 1 month and up is to be counted. Now, prior to this, in chapters 1 and 2, we spent time talking about the count of Am Yisrael, which is from the age of 20 and above. And specifically there, it says the phrase kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael, everyone who is eligible to go out and serve in the military. The primary purpose of the census of Am Yisrael is to count how many are of military age and available, because, again, the whole purpose here, they've finished building the Mishkan. They're now going to theoretically travel to Eretz Yisrael, conquer Eretz Yisrael. Of course, we know the story that we're going to take a 40-year detour somewhere along the line after the Ched of the Meraglim. But at this point in time, when Hashem is telling Moshe in the year 2, beginning of year 2, after they've left Egypt, to count Am Yisrael, this is primarily to divide up the land, to conquer the land, and to know who the Chayalim are going to be. Now, unlike that, because the tribe of Levi is not going to participate in this conquest, that's why they're not going to get a portion later on. They are to be counted from the age of 1 month and upward, and we're going to see why. The commentaries perhaps will discuss that. But again, that is a separate count, not included. Moshe counts them as he's commanded. It tells us the 3 sons of Levi are Gershon, Kat, and Merari. And I've highlighted some places here, but I'm going to skip off of these because I really want to focus not so much on the details of the count, which are going to be many. Not only are we told who the subfamilies are, but I really want to focus on the numbers. So, for example, Gershon has 7,500. Okay, the family of Gershon then tells us where they camped, what their jobs were. And we do the same thing with each of the 3 Levitical families. We give them a number, count how many there were. There were 8,600 of the family of Kahat. And from the family of Merari, and it tells us again what their jobs were and where they camped. And then finally it tells us from Merari, the 3rd family, there were 6,200. And again, what their jobs and where they camped were. And then, interestingly enough, in verse 39, for those of us who can't do math, the Torah wants us to give us the total. All of the counting of the Leviim that Moshe and Aaron counted according to their families were 22,000 people. Now, interestingly enough, and Rashi is going to comment on this, and we're going to see, if I add up the three numbers that I just read you of 86, 75, and 6,200, you're going to get to 22,300. And Rashi is going to ask, where did the other 300 disappear to that the Torah here lists 22,000? I hope we're going to get to that tonight. That's one of the things where I hope to discuss. Okay. And now, then, following counting the Leviim, Hashem gives Moshe another job, which is called Kol Zachar, B'char Zachar Livnei Yisrael. I want you to count all of the firstborn among the non-Leviim, the rest of Am Yisrael, Miben Chodesh V'malo, also from 1 month and above, and figure out the number. You are to take the Leviim in place of the firstborn, and the animals Leviim in place of all of the firstborn animals. Moshe counts them as Hashem has commanded in verse 42. Verse 43, it gives us a count of how many firstborn there were, 22,273. And then Hashem tells Moshe to exchange the 22,273 for the 22,000 Leviim, except there's one little problem. We have 273 that aren't going to get exchanged, and they have to each pay the standard amount for redemption of firstborn of 5 shekels. Okay, that's this whole chapter. Okay, and then what we do, how Moshe disposed of the money. So we're going to, first thing I want to focus on, if my computer will get working here, figure out what we're going, is I want to just compare, come on. All right, oh, come on. My computer is frozen. All right, let's get back in here, come on. I apologize, my computer has decided to freeze, and now I can't do anything. All right, let's go back out of screen share, stop share, and figure out why my computer is frozen. I apologize for the delay, ladies. For some reason, oh, great. My Word has, let's close this. Close. Apologize for the technical difficulties. Just probably pause the recording here. Okay. Now, one of the things I wanted to focus on before we start to understand what the issue I want to talk about is, I want to show you a little chart here that shows each of the tribes, if we can get it on the screen here, shows us the count of the tribes versus the count of Levites. Now, again, we said the Leviim were 22,300, but we have to understand that that is counting from the age of 1 month and above. Everybody else is only counting from 20 and above, and the smallest of them all is 32,000, and that's Menashe, which is really only half a tribe. So if we look at all of these tribes, the largest is Yehuda, 74,600. Again, 20 and above, and yet the Leviim are only 22,000 from a month and above. So we seem to have a very, very big dichotomy. And as a matter of fact, if I take 603,000 and I simply divide it by 12 for each of the tribes, I get an average of 50,000, which seems to be twice the size of the Leviim. So the Parshanim are trying to understand, why is the tribe of Levi the size it is? That's what we're going to spend a good portion of tonight's shiur on, I hope. Okay, and I hope we'll get some understanding. So Rashi starts. Firstly, Rashi wants to know why the Leviim have to be counted from the age of 1 month as opposed to the age of 20. He says, Miben Chodesh V'malo, they cast that counting from 1 month up, from Mishayatza Michlal Nefalim, Hu Nimna Likarei Shomer Mishmeret HaKodesh. The Leviim, from the time that they are born, are already, once they've reached 30 days old, which means they're a viable baby, they're a viable child, because it seems that in antiquity, people died very quickly. A lot of people died before the age of 30. So the halacha is that a child has to reach the age of 30 days before we can guarantee that it's a viable child, viable birth. Once they have reached that 30-day point, they are already counted as a Levi, as one of those who is in charge of watching and guarding the Mikdash. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shalom says, that it's normal, it was already a tradition that the tribe of Levi counted children from the time they reached 1 month old. Because because when it describes Yocheved later on, it tells that she was born. It tells us from the time she was born, she was already counted. She was born to Levi in Mitzrayim, im knisata b'Pesach Mitzrayim yoldoto. She was born as they entered Egypt. V'nimnit b'shivim nefesh, and she is counted among the 70 souls. So we see that she is part and parcel of already a person that gets counted, and that is again from birth. V'nimnit b'shivim nefesh is Rashi adds, she was added among the 70. When we go back to parshat Vayigash and we talk about Yaakov coming to Egypt with 70 people, there are only 69 names listed. And Rashi is said to in other places, she is number 70. And even though she's only an infant, she is already counted. So we see already that Leviim have already a history of being counted at an early age. Now, the question is, if you're Moshe Rabbeinu, okay, and you've done a count, you've just counted all of Am Yisrael. How did I count all of Am Yisrael? Everyone who was over the 20 had to come and present themselves, give their half shekel, and that was it. So we knew how many to count. Can't ask a 1 month old baby to come bring me a half a shekel, can I? So Rashi wants to know, how did Moshe count the Leviim from a month old? So Al Pi Hashem is what it adds. This is Moshe counts them through the mouth of Hashem Kiviyachol. Amar Moshe l'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, Echani nichnas lebatei kulam u'toch aleihem ladat minyan yon kehem. How can I go into every single house and count how many infants they've got? Amar l'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, aseh ata et sholcha v'ani aseh et shali. Hashem says to him, you do your part, I'll do my part. So halach Moshe v'yamad al petzach. Moshe would stand in front of the tent, v'shchina mekademet lefanav, and Hashem would tell him, Bad kol yotzet min ol v'omer kach v'kach tinoket yesh bo lazeh. That this count, unlike every other count where people had to present themselves to Moshe, this one Moshe has to go tent by tent, and Hashem tells him, Kiviyachol bat kol comes out at each tent, says, here's how many babies and children there are in this tent. Okay, so now, as I said, Rashi now raises the major question. Shnai Misrim Aleph. There are 22,000 Leviim. If you add the three numbers for the three subfamilies, you get to 22,300. Rashi gives the numbers: 7,500 for Gershon, Kas is 8,600, and Merari is 6,200. So we see total is, if you add, you get 22,300. The Lamalo Kalim Hashav Yivta, why aren't they included so that they can also redeem firstborns? Lo Hayuzakuk, and then the 273 wouldn't have to pay anything. You'd have enough Leviim to cover everybody. Amar Rabbi Seim Sechet Bechorot, the Gemara says in Bechorot that the reason they did not, that we only have 22,000, not 300, that these 300 Leviim Bechorot Hayu. These 300 were the firstborn of the Leviim, and as such, V'Hayudayam Sheyavkiu B'Atzmam Min HaPidjam. It's enough that they redeemed themselves, Kiviyachol. They couldn't redeem another firstborn because they were themselves firstborn and had to redeem themselves. So therefore, they could not be counted. And that's why we get only 22,000 instead of 22,300. Okay. And that's okay. Let's go here. All right. Now we're gonna, as I said, Chizkuni very just simply tells us why different ages, as I think I've already said. But let's read it through. Why are Leviim counted only from 1 month, whereas everybody else is counted from 20 and up? The purpose of counting Leviim is not to determine the size of an army, as it was with all the other tribes. That's why they are not counted from 20 and up. Yisrael. The whole reason that the Leviim are counted from 1 month and upward here is so they can redeem the firstborn, and the firstborn are also going to be counted from 1 month and upward. The din b'char piduya miben chodesh. We know that a firstborn has to be redeemed once he's 30 days old, as we do with Pitchin Ben on the 31st day. Okay. Now, Chizkuni asks a very interesting question, which I think everybody would be interested in, except the Kohanim, who wouldn't be interested in this. They don't want to hear the answer to this question, but everybody else would be. Question Chizkuni wants to know is, okay, so we see here that a firstborn needs to be redeemed. He has a choice. He can either be redeemed by a Levi or by paying 5 shekels, right? So the question is, today, why doesn't every person who has to do a Pidyon Ben just say, hey, I'll go find a Levi and be redeemed through him? Why, he asked this question, why can't a person who has a firstborn kid find a Levi, say, hey, will you be the one Levi who redeems my kid? Why not, right? Hainu Tama, the reason is, Shari Leviim shel Achshav, the Leviim, today's Leviim, Noldu me'avotem Leviim shekvar padu b'chorei Yisrael. I, as a Levi, am a descendant of a Levi who already redeemed the firstborn, right? Okay? So each Levi can only redeem one firstborn. So once he's redeemed the firstborn, all of his kids can't redeem any more firstborn. So they're all disqualified. So so you should say, hey, a firstborn shouldn't need to be redeemed because his father was a firstborn, perhaps. But he says, no, firstborn of now, Bamidbar. They're not necessarily descended from a firstborn. Okay, because I can be a secondborn son, but my firstborn son, if I'm not a Kohen or a Levi, has to be redeemed. They've never been redeemed. So the Bechorot, in theory, it says, Yitzchoni seems to be implying that if you're a firstborn, the son of a firstborn, who can trace his way all the way back to one of those firstborn back in the Midbar who was redeemed, you would not have to be redeemed again. You only have to be redeemed if somewhere in the line there's not a firstborn who was redeemed, which is a very interesting concept. I'd like to find somebody who can trace their genealogy back that far. It'd be wonderful to be able to do that. Okay. I just thought that was interesting. It has nothing to do with, as I said, the primary topic I want to talk about. That. So we're going to talk about, primary thing I want to talk about tonight is, why was the tribe of Levi so small? Okay. Okay. Okay, Ramban says, okay. Okay. Let's skip this. Let's go. Okay, here we go. Okay. Tribe of Levi was not like all the other tribes. When we look, we're counting, theoretically, we're counting them for a larger age range, and they still come out with the smallest number. When we count them from 30 to 50 next week, we're going to find that there are only 8,000 of them. So it seems that Levi is not, it's not just they're the smallest. Obviously, one of the 12 tribes has to be the smallest. But it's not that they're the smallest by a factor of 2. Rather than okay, there are a couple thousand less than the next smallest tribe. But now the Gemara says that one of the reasons that the tribe of Levi was small was because since they had to carry all of the things from the Mishkan, if they did not show the proper respect, they would lose. They might get killed because they didn't show proper respect, as we find with Uzzah in the case of bringing the Aron in David's day, and as we find with Nadav and Avihu in a different context. So clearly, this can't apply to this count because the Mishkan is just being set up. They haven't been carrying the Mishkan up till now. So there's that quote excuse or reason why the tribe of Levi might be smaller can't apply now. So it seems strange the Raman uses this term. If the tribe of Levi, who are the servants and the beloved ones of Hashem, why didn't they multiply the same way everybody else multiplied? And my rationale for this is this lends more credence, strengthens the argument that Chazal said in the Medrash Tanchuma, that throughout the time they were in Egypt, the tribe of Levi was never slaves. They did not serve in the workforce, the labor force, as all the other tribes did. Yisrael. So therefore, what does that have to do with the fact that they didn't increase and multiply? Yisrael, concerning the rest of the tribes, that the Egyptians embittered their lives, that the Egyptians embittered their lives to try to keep the population down. What does Pharaoh say to his people? Am Yisrael is getting too populated, too many of them. We got to do something to cut down this population growth. And that's when they start enslaving them. HaKadosh Baruch Hu marbe otam keneged gezerat Mitzrayim. Hashem allowed them to multiply miraculously to counteract, to thwart this decree of the Egyptians. The Egyptians were trying to keep them from growing. Hashem says, you think you're going to stop them? I'm going to make them grow even faster. As the pasuk itself testifies to in Sefer Shemot, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. When the Paro decrees that all the child tells the midwives that they should kill all the boys, says again, when they refuse, the people grew even more. So we see that the people are growing even though Paro is trying to stop them. And Hashem is telling him, you think you're going to keep the population down? I'm going to make it grow faster. So it seems Hashem, for the rest of Am Yisrael, made them grow very quickly. Avol Shevet Levi, but the tribe of Levi, they had normal childbirth rates, like everybody else had. And that's why they did not multiply to the same extent that the other tribes did. That's what Ramban wants to say. Now, Ramban adds a second possible reason. For Ulai, he says, perhaps, perhaps the reason they did not multiply as much was because Yaakov was angry at them. Yaakov, when he gives them, we go back to parshat Vayechi. What does Yaakov say in parshat Vayechi to Levi? He also says Shimon, by the way. And by the way, Shimon is, I think, number 3 in terms of size at this point, but that's a different story. But it says that Yaakov says, their anger should be cursed because it's very powerful. So he was a little upset at them because of what they did in Shechem. And other things, perhaps. Interestingly enough, we find that at the time they enter Eretz Yisrael, 40 years later, the smallest tribe is Shimon. So he says perhaps Levi and Shimon both felt a little bit of that anger from Yaakov Avinu. However, Levi, Shushevet Chasidav, lo nitmait b'magifa. Since Hashem wanted to spare the tribe of Levi having to go through a plague, which is what happened to Shimon. How did Shimon go from being the third largest to the smallest? Well, go look and see what happened in Shittim, where 24,000 people died. But again, and that perhaps is a fulfillment of Yaakov's anger. Ramban wants to suggest Levi, Hashem didn't want Levi to have to go through a plague to get down to that number, so he didn't let them increase to begin with. That's Ramban's second possible thought. Okay. The Nitziv, Hamek Davar. Ramban goes through and tries to explain this small number of Leviim. And they hadn't started they hadn't yet taken up the task of carrying the Mishkan, which perhaps might have thinned out their numbers. Venira, and it appears it appears that also when the Jews were in Egypt, the tribe of Levi was dedicated to the service of Hashem. That they already were involved in some type of spiritual activity of trying to transmit the values of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to the rest of the people. And because of this work, there were 2 reasons why they would have been smaller. Firstly, Hashem, those who are closer to him, Hashem is much more exacting with. The closer we are to Hashem, the more exacting he is with us. Therefore, they are more likely to have been punished for whatever sins they may have committed. Apparently, the tribe of Levi, because of their spiritual bent, were more aware of what Hashem wants from us as people, as human beings, as Jews. And therefore, the Kiblu Aleim Old Torah Mitzvot K'mo, they accepted those traditions that they had gotten from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They accepted to carry them out and to live by them. The Nasa K'mo Neder, and therefore it became to them like a Neder that they make, an oath that they had made to keep these traditions. And when you don't keep something that you've taken an oath to keep or a vow to keep, it counts as a sin. Masha'ain came Kol Yisrael, which does not apply to the rest of Am Yisrael. Lo Yadu Ma'uman Matan Torah. They did not have any connection to spirituality until Matan Torah. They did not accept any of these strictures, of these strictness as things that the Avot had accepted. They didn't accept upon themselves. So that's one reason. Second reason, but by the fact that they were close, the one who was the closer we come to Hashem, Gidulo Yakar, the Kasha Latzed El Hagmar. Kamo Eitz Machal, the more we focus on spirituality, the less we focus on physicality, and therefore we don't seem to have as much physical growth. Kamo Eitz Machal, like a fruit tree. A fruit tree doesn't produce fruit or doesn't reach its maturity of producing fruit as fast as a non-fruit-bearing tree provides its shade and its growth. And the more valuable or dear the fruit is, the harder it is the longer it takes to grow. We know that a person is compared to an eitz, to a tree. That the higher level we are than our friend, it takes us longer to blossom, to reach maturity, to grow properly. And that's why Am Yisrael, until they got to Egypt, there was no great population growth. Avram has one kid, Yitzchak has two kids, so there's not this great population growth until they reach Mitzrayim, excuse me. And it's only in Mitzrayim where they start to really grow and be fruitful and become a nation. For the rest of Am Yisrael, that was fine. But for Bnei Levi, Bnei Levi don't really start blossoming and producing fruit and growing as a tribe until they actually reach Eretz Yisrael, coming home. He has a whole mamar on this on Breshit Rabbah that talks about why Levi was so small. Okay. Arachayim Kadosh. Kol Zocher ben Chodesh Malach. Tam mi ben Chodesh. The reason that we start from ben Chodesh, Kvizbana Sherbo, Hema Taftem, Shema Bechorot. Okay, let's go. I want to skip this. I left this in. This is not possible. Here we go. Kol Kedei HaLevim. Here we go again. Same thing. We have again the same question that as we've all been asking. That's why it's here. Ramban Zal Tam B'Dar Sheish L'Kmaba. He quotes the Ramban. Ki HaLevim Hein Heino Yididei Hashem. If the Leviim are the tribe that's closest to Hashem, Ukrovav, Asher Lo Chatu Be'egel. Not only are they closest to Hashem, were not involved in the Chet HaEgel at all. V'lo Nagfu, there was no plague. The plague that killed those who were involved in the Egel did not affect them. V'lo Hargu, they weren't killed. V'lo Hushku, they didn't involve in any of the three aspects of the Chet HaEgel. Ech nitmatu kol kach mikol hashvarim she'eino magiyim b'misparam miben chodesh lachati shevet hakaton b'Yisrael. That's the Ramban's question. כשתמר מספרו מבין חף לא יגיע לשליש רביע. וראיתי לי שהשם בשני דרכים. And I see that he answered in two different possibilities. האחד הוא לצד שהריבוי בא מצד העינוי. First thing he says was that because of the affliction, that's why they increased, as it says, "Chasheyanu oto kenya bevachen yisrot v'derech beit mitam kasel shel Yaakov v'ino lo v'shol." So he brings down Ramban, as we said, had two different reasons. One was because Hashem was making them miraculously grow. Second was the Levi was smaller because Yaakov was angry at Levi, and that's why Levi didn't experience the same level of growth that everybody else did. Ube'enai. Now that was he quoted that from Ramban. Now the Chaim Kodesh says the following: Ube'enai, in my opinion, Tama Beit Rachel. The second reason is a very, 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 very tough to accept. It's hard for me to accept that. We don't find that Yaakov's anger would have caused a recognizable difference in the size of the families. Because we're going to find the next time Leviim get counted, which is in Divrei Hayamim, The Leviim were shmonu shloshim elf. They were up to 38,000 from 30 to age 50, which means they multiplied rather frequently after they got to Eretz Yisrael. They were less than 9,000 when they are counted here from 30 to 50, and by that point in time, they were already up to 38,000, which is a five-fold increase. Nimtu shosifu dalad chalakim. They added 80%. They grew by 400%. Bikiruv al mispar zeh, very quickly from the number they were in the desert. Ubimispar b'nei Yisrael habat sham lo bo lichlal mispar amukan. However, the rest of Bnei Yisrael didn't necessarily grow at the same rate that the Leviim grow between the time of these two census. And so it appears later on that Levi is one of the larger tribes, because if you add, if they're already 38,000 just from the age 30 to 50, how much were they from 20 to and above? So they must have been one of the larger tribes by that point in time. So if the fact that Yaakov was angry at them was what kept them small, they would have stayed small. They wouldn't have suddenly had a population growth spurt. So that's why he doesn't like Ramban's second teretz. He likes the first answer. He says it's a good reason, the fact that Hashem increased the rest of the tribes because Ashpar was trying to limit them, and he didn't do that for Levi. However, he says there's a little problem with that. Okay, and to do that, he brings out another midrash. Okay, now interesting midrash. This answer that Ramban gives, that the unnatural growth of the rest of Am Yisrael is due to the fact that Paro was trying to destroy them, he says that doesn't work because there's a mamar in the Chamasal in Breshit Rabbah, Perak Ayin Test, that says the following. Sha'amru. It says the following, which, by the way, is a very interesting concept. Okay, wait till you hear this one. Lo made Yaakov at Yigil Yisrael Kal Mispar Samach Ribut. That Yaakov Avinu, who gets to Egypt with 70 people, did not die until they had reached a population of 600,000. Okay? Now think about that. That means in 17 years, according to this midrash, and again, it's a midrash, Breshit Rabbah, they went from 70 people to 60,000 people in a period of the 17 years between 600,000. What did I say? 600,000. In the time between the 17 years from the time Yaakov arrived in Egypt till he died. Rather interesting midrash. Okay? And he says, according to that midrash, do I want to figure out these two midrashim? So if that's the case, in other words, if this medrash is correct, that they were at 600,000 before Yaakov died, then what is Hashem saying to Paro, that the more power presses them, the more they're going to grow? How do I explain that verse according to this midrash? Kamo Kain, what does it mean? Perush, the explanation of that pasuk is Kamo Kain b'shiur harishon yarbeh v'lo hayamit ma'et. Okay, the fact is that Hashem is promising Am Yisrael that the size you're at now of 600,000, you're going to stay that way. No matter how much power tries to reduce your population, it's not going to work. Not that you're going to grow miraculously, but he won't be able to cut the number of people you've got. Hagam shayu mayhem, even though the Egyptians would kill from them, and afflict them, Hayakoach Yisrael, Am Yisrael enough energy. They were able to make up the difference, to keep the population at a stable size, even though the Egyptians were trying to destroy them. Which, by the way, I think this is a very interesting comment. The Or HaChaim, remember, is writing this in the 18th century. I would have been more interested if the Netziv had written this in the 20th century, dealing with the Holocaust, about population being able to stay the same size. Side comment. What does that explain? In Yaakov, all these 600,000 were less than 17 years old. Remember, they started with 70. All the 70 produced 600,000, but they were all kids. So the Egyptians didn't recognize how powerful they were going to become when they all grew up. What does it mean? Bnei Yisrael be multiplied and got strong? They were all kids. Nobody knew them because they were all home with their being raised by their mommies. They didn't go out and get involved in the community and whatever. When they all grew up, suddenly, whoa, where'd all these people come from? So if I go by this midrash that says they reached 600,000 before Yaakov died, clearly the increase in population had nothing to do with Paro afflicting them and whether the Leviim were working or not working. The Lama Lo Yehekein L'Shevet Levi. So if that's the case, if they'd already gotten there before Yaakov died, why would Shevet Levi been any less? The Ein Lomar, and it's that we can't say Shehayu Kimo Kain Ravim Kishara Shvatim Beit Pirad Avihem. Oh, when Yaakov died, they were approximately the same size as all the other tribes. Something happened to Leviim after Yaakov died that they became a smaller tribe. And he says it doesn't make sense to say that, oh, because they weren't afflicted, they didn't reproduce at the same level. Again, it doesn't make sense. Why would they be any less than their original amount? Chazal Amru, and even though Gemara wants to say that the reason that Levi was smaller was because of all of the casualties from carrying the ark without proper respect, that can't be now because that can only be after they were already counted. So therefore, he doesn't like Ramban's two reasons, and he doesn't like, it says this medrash makes it very, very difficult to understand that even more. And now he goes here. Appears to me that Kishevet Levi Masechad Lahem K'maseh Amram, that the reason the Shevet Levi was small was because of Amram. It was all Amram's fault. Asher Sholach et Ishto B'Gvizil B'Shvil Gezerat HaBen HaYilod. Because when Paro decreed all the sons that are going to be killed, what did Amram do? The Midrash said again, all Midrash, not written in the Torah anywhere. Amram went and divorced his wife because he said, "Why should we have kids? Why have kids if they're going to get Paro's going to kill them all?" Since the tribe of Levi were a little bit more laid back, I don't know, they were a little bit more able to function because they weren't being enslaved. Lo nomas libam kol kach, and they hadn't despaired of ever being redeemed. Lirot nit'eyam mushlachen b'yar, they could not stand to see their children get thrown in the river the way the other tribes could. K'masei Ish Yisrael, like the rest of Am Yisrael. Why? Hashem mitzada shibud, because they were so enslaved. The ol avodah, the yoke of all the extra work. Husal v'hukal beinayam, they were really lower. They had no low self-esteem. They therefore in their hearts it didn't matter. It didn't have the same impact watching their kids getting thrown in the river. So they seemed to not care that so they didn't go and divorce their wives. So they would continue having children. However, the tribe of Levi all followed Amram and all divorced their wives. So there was a period of time they stopped having kids. Guess what happens when you stop having kids? Population goes down. Okay, so therefore, Shevet Levi Osakain. So all of Shevet Levi did one thing, and all the rest of the tribes did another thing. So that's why Shevet Levi's count went down, because there was a period of time where they all divorced their wives. The Zelacha Oti Amram Shalach et Ishto. And the proof of the pudding is that Amram did divorce his wife. And the Torah doesn't say this. The Torah doesn't tell us that Amram or that all the Leviim went and divorced their wives. But clearly, if Amram's the leader of tribe of Levi and he does it, all Leviim are going to follow suit. But the rest of Am Yisrael didn't necessarily follow suit. That's what the Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh wants to say. Ella me'ashlachat ha'inyan no doubt. But if we look at it, we'll figure it out. Ulaved al kol shivto yatza. And all of his tribe followed him. And that's exactly why the population of Levi is less than all the other tribes. If the men are divorcing their wives, you're not going to have any wives aren't going to have kids all on their own. Got to have males and females to produce the next generation. But now, wait a minute. That didn't last long because Amram went back and did remarry his wife, and they had Moshe Rabbeinu. We can't infer from this that they all went back and remarried their wives. Because he had a nevuah that Hashem was going to allow a redeemer to be born from him. So that's why he went back and remarried his wife. Again, Midrash, again, it's all Midrash. This is all based on the fact that what did he do? He went back and remarried his wife, and they had Moshe Rabbeinu. In the fact that he had a prophecy that Moshe was going to be born, somebody was going to be born, was going to be the Redeemer of Am Yisrael. He had a prophecy also because Miriam had the same prophecy. As the Medrash says, she went to see whether her prophecy was going to be fulfilled through Moshe. V'im Tomar. So now he has a different question, which I think the Ramban started addressing. If they're dedicated to the Torah, and what's the first mitzvah in the Torah? Be fruitful and multiply. If they're dedicated to Torah, how can they limit and try to minimize the number of kids they're going to have? Perhaps they explained it. The reason they stopped having kids was because they did not want to toil and raise children who were not going to be able to live, or were going to be killed. And we find a similar thing that says, if there's a famine going on and the whole world is stricken by a famine, you're not supposed to be having marital relations. Even though this will cause a limit will cause a diminution in the population. Nonetheless, we know the halacha tells us that if there is a time when all the world is in a terrible straits, we should be davening to Hashem and not worrying about our physical pleasures. The Danu Kamokain, and they judged the same thing. Because they did not want their children to have to be destroyed, they decided not to have them at all. And therefore, what he's saying is exactly the opposite. It's not that Levi was so small. Saying it's exactly the opposite. Hashem made a miracle that even this small amount remained. That was a miracle, because if they all left their wives, there wouldn't have been a next generation. So the fact that they even survived as a tribe was a miracle. That even though there was a period where they all divorced their wives, afterwards Hashem restored their number, and that was the miracle that they had lots of children. Very interesting way of looking at things. Okay, then we get to Klei Akar. I'm going to close with this. Okay, 22,000 is the number that the Torah tells. Even though it was 22,300, we say there were 22,000. Kvar Amarnu, we've already said that the reason that there are 22,000 we have a pasuk that says, Rivavot is 10,000s, Alfei is thousands, and from that pasuk, the Chazal explain that a minimum of 2 10,000s, 20,000, and 2 single thousands, 22,000, is the smallest number of a group, of a population that Hashem will rest His presence on. We need at least 22,000 people for Hashem to rest His presence. So it's interesting that the number of Leviim comes out to exactly 22,000, because they are the Machaneh Shechina. They are the tribe that Hashem rests His presence on. Al Kain Miyatam HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, Hashem minimized their number. To show this exact number of 22,000. That's the minimum amount you need to create a godly camp. And then he brings down the Ramban that since they were not involved in the Inu Mitzrayim, they were not in the Viboy, we've talked already. Afal Pisha Zed Derech Drash, even says this whole thing is a drash. I want to explain this whole thing that the Ramban said. Hashem neged hateva. Hashem did not allow Am Yisrael to increase supernaturally. Only to counteract the counsel of the goyim who tried to minimize the Jewish people through the affliction. Hashem, and Hashem desired that they should suffer, that the goyim should suffer and do the opposite of what they tried to achieve. The Adrab, and therefore Hashem contradicts things to what the Goyim wanted to do. Here, Brotam Chutz Min HaTeva. Not only did he allow them to grow naturally, but he allowed them to grow supernaturally. Kiolidu, as the Medrash there in Shmot says, Holidu Shisha Bekeres Achad, that they all had six, every birth was six tuplets. So they multiplied very quickly. Avol Shevet HaLevi, Shevet Levi, Lohoya Biklal Ha'inu, they weren't afflicted. While Cain Lohoya Tzorach Larbotam Keneged HaTeva, there was no need to cause them to be increased against the natural order. And they had natural amount of natural growth rate. This seems to make good sense. And that's exactly what the Ramban meant. Now he gives another final answer, which I think is also important. Okay, why does Hashem not allow the tribe of Levi to be that large? So that Am Yisrael won't complain, all right, there are so many Leviim and we have to support them all. Levi's the smallest tribe, they'll be easy enough to support. There's that Tam Rachok. He says, however, I don't like that reason. There's nothing holding Hashem back from finding other ways to support and provide for those who are serving him and doing what he wants to do. So again, he doesn't like, even though others have said that, he doesn't like that. And others say, the reason they're so small is because the holy work caused them to be limited. I know Arono Shel Yaakov. Which Aron is it talking about? Not the Aron in the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan that hasn't been built yet. But if this Medrash is the reason they were limited in number is because of an Aron, they were carrying Yaakov. They were the one who carried Yaakov's Aron when it went back to Eretz Yisrael. Vudat Haraman, she's Karnu Kfor Lamal Parshat Vayetze. Pascal Ken Karash Moda. Okay, we have that quote elsewhere. V'yeshomer, and another thing he brings down. Shetiba Kodesh Baruch Hu Shelo Yihu Kulam Tzadikim. Hashem saw prophetically that they weren't going to be all righteous. Al Kain Havir Rabim Mehem Min Ha'olam. Therefore, many of them died early at young age before they went out and became Rishonim. V'nish'aru kav v'naki, and they remained like a fine sifted flour. So that all those who were involved in carrying the Aron would be righteous. And that's what it means when it says the Aron caused them to die out, even before the Aron was there, because Hashem was basically sifting through to make sure only the righteous ones survived. That's why Levi was so small. And again, he's going to bring down various answer here. Since Amram divorced his wife and there was a period of time where they weren't multiplying, how could all of Am Yisrael wouldn't have survived? That it was the merit of the women that Am Yisrael was redeemed. And the Gemara of the Medrash there says that it was only through the merit of the women who did all these wonderful things for their husband to make sure that they had kids. And they kept their faith up that Hashem was going to redeem them. From here we see that the men in Egypt who were busy being enslaved, not the tribe of Levi, but the men who were being enslaved, would not have been able to survive without their women, without their wives. The Od Masik Shomshin, apart from Rav Masada, the Medrash there says that they would have children out in the fields. Shmamina, which seems to imply that Afilu B'Shat HaGzera Lo Girshin Nishotem. Even when Amram and the tribe of Levi all divorced their wives, the rest of Am Yisrael didn't. Elavada, Mashe Masik Amdu Kulam Girshin Nishotem. When the Medrash says that they all divorced their wives, doesn't mean all of Am Yisrael. Hainu Kol B'nei Shevet Levi Shayo Hayu Bichlal HaShibud, that were not enslaved. But despite the fact that they weren't enslaved, they were fearful of Pharaoh's decree of throwing all the children in the river. Because concerning the day Moshe was born, Pharaoh even commanded all the Egyptian babies to be thrown in the river that day. They were also afraid that they would be included in this decree. The Amdu Rov Shevet Levi, and the majority of the tribe of Levi stood met Zman Rav for a long period of time below Nashim without their wives. Kemosha Amar Amram Zman Rav Loisha, just like Amram spent a period of time without his wife. The Alkain, therefore, Haya Shevet Levi Matemis Par. That's why Shevet Levi was the smallest of the tribes. That seems to make the most sense, he says. However, now he finishes with Ubachar Hashem Bahem. The reason Hashem chooses the tribe of Levi, Mitzadi Otamutim, specifically because they're the smallest tribe. We find in many places Hashem doesn't like big, powerful things to choose. He chooses things that are small, less strong, less powerful. Again, as we have a pasuk that said, not because we Am Yisrael are the biggest of all the nations that Hashem chose us. Ki atem hama'at, you're the smallest of the nations. And similarly, he says, even among the family of the three families of Gershon, Kat, and Merari, all of them were not large, and the smallest is Merari is the one who he chooses for the hardest, the heaviest labor. So again, it seems that if we look at the whole collection of possible reasons why the tribe of Levi was small, there are a number of different reasons given, but I think the key here is understanding this last sentence, that because Hashem wanted them to be small, and therefore he chooses them as being the smallest, because Hashem wants us to understand that everything we accomplish is accomplished only with his help. And that has to be why we're small. Because if we were the largest and most powerful nation on the earth, nobody would credit our success to Hashem. The fact that we are so small and, quote, theoretically, seemingly so unpowerful is the fact that gives credence and gives us our ability to be a springboard and a light to the Goyim, because they clearly realize, and I think today there are those that realize, and as there have been throughout history, among the Goyim, we realize that the only reason Am Yisrael is successful is because we have Hashem pushing us and helping us and doing miracles on our behalf. And we hope and pray that those miracles should continue, and we should be zocheh to the Gula Shlema, and we will again see, we'll get the real answer as to why Shevet Levi was so small. I open up now for questions, comments, and feedback. And anybody, questions or comments? Okay, have a good rest of the week. A Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining again. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we will, I do plan on giving a shiur next week on Wednesday night, which is Erev Chag. So I hope you're not planning on doing too much cooking then. Laila Tov, have a good rest.